If someone had told me 10 years ago, when I first sketched a blueprint on a napkin, that the most complex structure I would ever navigate would not be made of steel and glass, but of the silent, charged space between myself and another person, I would have laughed. I dealt in absolutes, in right angles and load-bearing walls. I built worlds on paper that were safe, predictable, and entirely under my control. My life was a reflection of that design. A quiet apartment, a predictable routine, a solitude so deeply ingrained it felt like a part of my own architecture. Then, Julian Kane walked into the firm, and the foundations of my quiet little world began to crack. He was not a quiet force. Julian was a storm system in a bespoke suit. He moved through the open-plan office like a weather front, all low-pressure intensity and the crackle of impending lightning. People orbited him. His laugh was loud, his gestures broad, his confidence a physical presence in any room he occupied. He was the firm's star project manager, the man who could charm difficult clients and strong-arm stubborn contractors with the same easy grin. And I, Leo, watched him from the safety of my drafting corner. My desk was my fortress, piled high with sketches and code books, a barricade against the casual chaos of office life. From behind that paper wall, I observed him. It was a kind of masochistic ritual. I would trace the line of his shoulders under his jacket, the way he'd run a hand through his dark hair when frustrated, the sharp angle of his jaw when he was concentrating on a problem. He was a study in lines and forms, a design I couldn't solve, and the longing I felt was a dull, constant ache behind my ribs. A foolish, impossible. He was, for all intents and purposes, straight. He talked about dates with women whose names I immediately forgot, brought a beautiful blonde to the holiday party, and carried himself with an uncomplicated masculine energy that left no room for interpretation. Or so I told myself. So my watching was safe. It was academic. It was the hopeless, private study of a piece of art you know you can never own. He was a marble statue, and I was the unnoticed security guard on the night shift. Our interactions were minimal and excruciatingly professional. Leo, I need to revise schematics for the Harrison project by noon. Leo, did you factor in the updated zoning variants? His voice was always crisp, efficient, a tool to get a job done. He rarely used my name, but when he did, it felt like a spotlight hitting me, exposing the frantic, foolish flutter in my chest. For him, I was just a pair of hands that produced reliable drawings. A cog in his well-oiled machine. That distance was the defining feature of our relationship, a chasm of hierarchy and assumption. He was the sun, and I was a distant planet, content to feel a little of his warmth without ever dreaming of getting closer. Getting closer meant getting burned. My solitude was a carefully constructed firebreak. It was safe. It was lonely, but it was safe. Then came the Blackwood Estate project. It was the disruption I never saw coming. An eccentric billionaire had bought a sprawling, dilapidated historical property deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, and wanted to turn it into a state-of-the-art, sustainable retreat. It was the most ambitious project the firm had ever taken on, and Julian, naturally, was leading it. I was assigned as the lead architect on site. Just me. And him. You and I will head up there Monday, he'd announced, stopping by my desk. He didn't sit, just leaned against the partition, radiating an energy that made my personal space feel violated. Spend a week on site. Get the preliminary survey done. Map out the structural challenges firsthand. No distractions, my heart did a painful little flip-flop. A week. Alone with him. It was a fantasy and a nightmare tangled into one. My stomach felt like a nest of angry wasps. Okay, I managed to say, my voice sounding thin and reedy. He nodded, his eyes already scanning the next email on his phone. Good. Pack for all weather. The forecast is unstable. And then he was gone, a whirlwind moving on to its next point of impact, leaving me in the sudden, ringing silence. The air still tasted of his cologne. The drive up was a masterclass in tension. He drove the big four-wheel drive with casual competence, one hand on the wheel, the other drumming a restless rhythm on the center console. He handled the winding mountain roads with an ease that seemed to be his default state for everything. The The radio played low, some generic rock station. I, on the other hand, sat rigid in the passenger seat, my hands clasped so tightly in my lap my knuckles were white. I stared out the window, watching the city fall away, replaced by endless stretches of pine and rock. The civilization I used for armor was peeling away with every mile marker. It was just us in this metal box, hurtling toward a week of forced proximity. Every time he shifted gears and his arm brushed my knee, a jolt went through me, a ridiculous, overblown reaction to an accidental touch. I felt like a live wire. The estate was even more isolated than I'd imagined. A long, unpaved road led to a collection of crumbling stone buildings, beautiful in their decay, surrounded by a forest so thick and old it seemed to swallow the sound. Our accommodation was a small, rustic caretaker's cabin set a little way from the main house. One room, a stone fireplace, a kitchenette, and 2 narrow cots. My throat went dry. "Cozy," Julian said, dropping his bags by the door. There was a flicker of something in his expression, not quite humor, not quite annoyance. Just an acknowledgement of the situation. The first day was a blur of work. We were professionals. We fell into our roles. He assessed the logistics, the access points, the sheer scale of the required demolition. I walked the creaking halls of the main house, my sketchbook in hand, feeling the bones of the old place, sketching the lines, measuring the decay. We spoke only of work, of support beams and water damage and foundation integrity. The professional distance was back, a fragile shield I held up with all my might. But the shield couldn't last. Not here. In the evenings, the professional roles dissolved. We were just 2 men in a small wooden box, the vast, dark wilderness pressing in on all sides. The generator for the cabin provided a few hours of weak, flickering light before sputtering out, leaving us with only the fire we'd built in the hearth. It was in that firelight that I started to see him. Really see him. Not Julian Kane, the project manager. Just Julian. The hard, confident lines of his face softened in the warm glow. I saw the exhaustion etched around his eyes, a weariness his office persona never allowed. I saw a thin, white scar cutting through his left eyebrow, a detail I'd never noticed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the firm. He'd sit across from me, staring into the flames, and for long stretches he would be completely, utterly still. The restless energy was gone, replaced by a profound quiet that felt more honest than his loud office laughter ever did. One evening, the generator gave a particularly loud cough and died for good. Julian swore under his breath and went outside to fight with it. I watched him from the doorway, his silhouette a dark shape against the deepening twilight. I saw his shoulders slump in defeat after 20 minutes of pulling the starter cord to no effect. He kicked the metal housing a single sharp act of frustration before turning back to the cabin. "It's dead," he said, his voice flat. He walked past me and sank onto his cot, rubbing his face with his hands. The master of the universe, defeated by a cheap motor. And in that moment, the entire dynamic between us shifted. He looked lost, vulnerable. The carefully constructed image of effortless competence had a crack in it. And I, the quiet observer, the cog in the machine, knew something he didn't. "There's a manual pump," I said, my voice quiet in the sudden stillness. He looked up, his eyes shadowed. "What?" "The water pump for the well. I saw it on the original estate schematics from the 1890s. It's in a small shed behind the main house. It should still work. We can get water for coffee, at least." He just stared at me. The look on his face was one I'd never seen before. It was surprise, yes, but something else too. A sliver of respect. For the first time, he was looking at me not as his subordinate, but as someone who had a solution he didn't. The playing field, for a brief, startling moment, felt level. We found the pump, and after a bit of effort, we got a stream of cold, clean water flowing. It felt like a monumental victory. Back in the cabin, we boiled the water over the fire to make coffee in a dented old percolator. We sat on the floor, backs against our cots, sipping the hot, bitter liquid from tin mugs. The silence between us was different now. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was comfortable, shared. The storm hit on the third night. It came without warning, a sudden violence of wind and rain that lashed against the little cabin. The world outside the windows dissolved into a churning, roaring darkness. The temperature dropped. The wind howled like a hungry animal. We piled more wood on the fire, the flames leaping and casting our shadows, huge and distorted, against the rough-hewn walls. The blueprints for the estate were spread out on the floor between us, held down at the corners by rocks. We were trying to work, trying to maintain that last shred of professional normalcy, but the storm was too big, too loud. It was a third presence in the room, demanding all our attention. "This is something else," Julian said, his voice raised over the roar of the wind. "The forecast said unstable." I replied, a weak attempt at a joke. He actually smiled, a real, tired smile that reached his eyes. Understatement of the year. We fell silent again, listening to the assault on our tiny shelter. I was acutely aware of his proximity. He was only a few feet away, one knee drawn up, his arm resting on it. I could feel the heat coming off his body, smell the faint, clean scent of his skin mingling with the wood smoke. My heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of my ribs. "Stay calm, Leo. Just stay calm." He reached for a pencil to make a note on the plans, the same pencil I was reaching for. It was a clumsy, uncoordinated moment. His fingers brushed against mine. It wasn't a jolt. It was a detonation. A shock of pure, white-hot heat shot up my arm, straight to my chest, where it exploded. My breath hitched. I snatched my hand back as if I'd been burned. My entire body was humming, every nerve ending lit up and screaming. It was the most insignificant of touches. An accident. But it felt like the most profound physical contact of my entire life. He froze. His hand hovered over the blueprint for a second before he slowly pulled it back. He didn't look at the plans. He looked at me. His eyes, dark and unreadable in the flickering firelight, held mine. The sound of the storm faded into a dull roar in the background. The world shrank to the space between us, a space that was suddenly so charged with unspoken energy I felt I could barely breathe. My mind was a chaotic flood of panic. He knows. He felt it. He's disgusted. He's going to say something. Fire me. This is the end. But he said nothing. He just held my gaze, his own expression a mask of confusion, of something I couldn't name. The silence stretched, pulled taut between us like a wire. I could hear my own blood pounding in my ears. I had to look away. I dropped my eyes to the floor, my face burning with shame. I felt utterly, hopelessly exposed. The moment passed. Or rather, he let it pass. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud, and picked up a different pencil. We should focus on the drainage plan for the north wing. With this much rain, it's going to be a key issue. His voice was strained. Back to business. Back to the shield. I mumbled my agreement, my own voice of strangers. But the shield was full of cracks now. The air had been permanently altered. We both knew it. That accidental touch had said everything I'd spent years trying to hide. The rest of the night was an exercise in agonizing awareness. Every shift of his weight, every breath he took, I felt it as if it were my own. We barely spoke. The storm raged on, mirroring the tempest inside me. When we finally retreated to our separate cots, sleep felt like an impossible dream. I lay there in the dark, listening to the rain and the sound of his breathing, my skin still burning where he'd touched me. The storm trapped us in the cabin for another full day. The road would be a river of mud, impassable. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. We were well and truly stuck. The tension from the night before carried over, a heavy fog that filled the small space. We moved around each other with a new, awkward caution. We made small talk about the storm, about the project, about anything and everything except the one thing that was screaming between us. The memory of our hands touching. The look in his eyes. By late afternoon, the silence had become a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I couldn't bear it anymore. I was sitting on the floor, sketching idly in my notebook, not of buildings, but of the patterns the firelight made on the stone hearth. Anything to keep my hands and mind busy. Julian was on his cot, leaning against the wall, staring into the fire. He hadn't spoken in over an hour. The stillness from him was different today. It wasn't peaceful. It was coiled. tense. Finally, he broke the silence. His voice was low, rough. "You're always watching me." My head snapped up. My pencil froze on the page. My heart stopped. This is it. The confrontation. The end. What? I whispered, my throat tight. He didn't look at me. He kept his eyes on the flames. "Back at the office. I see you. You look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. Like you're trying to solve a puzzle. Or read a book in a language you don't quite understand." He paused, and the next words came out even quieter, laced with a vulnerability that stunned me. "I got used to it. And this week, being out here, working, you haven't been. You've been looking at the walls, the plans, the trees. Not at me." He finally turned his head, and his gaze pinned me to the floor. The firelight danced in his eyes, and I saw a universe of confusion and something else. Something that looked terrifyingly like longing. "I missed it," he said, the words barely audible over the crackle of the fire. "I missed the way you looked at me." The world tilted on its axis. The air left my lungs in a rush. Of all the things I had expected him to say, this was not one of them. My meticulously constructed reality, where he was oblivious and I was invisible, shattered into a million pieces. He saw me. He saw my watching. And he missed it? My mind was a blank slate. All the witty retorts, all the professional deflections I might have prepared were gone. All that was left was the raw, terrifying, exhilarating truth. I started, but my voice failed. I swallowed, trying to find words in the wreckage of my composure. "I didn't think you noticed. I notice everything," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Especially you, Leo." He said my name. Not as a command, not as a label. He said it like it was a secret he'd been holding on to. He pushed himself off the cot and moved to sit on the floor in front of me. The space between us was gone. He was close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body again, see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. The intensity of his focus was overwhelming. It wasn't the focus of a project manager dissecting a problem. It was the focus of a man searching for an answer. "Why?" he asked, his voice soft and insistent. "Why do you look at me like that?" My fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach. But beneath it, a tiny, fragile seed of courage began to sprout. He had just handed me a stick of dynamite and a lit match. I could let it fizzle out, retreat back to the safety of my silence. Or I could light the fuse and see what happened. For the first time in my life, the risk of staying silent felt greater than the risk of speaking. Because, I said, my voice shaking but clear, "When I look at you, I see everything I'm not. Confident, decisive, easy in your own skin. And I admire that." It was a half-truth, a safe truth. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. I took a breath. "And because I think you're the most beautiful man I've ever seen." The words hung in the air between us, terrifying and liberating. I had said it. I had finally said it. I braced for the impact, for the recoil of disgust, the awkward apology, the polite but firm rejection. Julian didn't recoil. He didn't even blink. He just watched my face, his own expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, a look of profound understanding dawned in his eyes. It was as if I had just given him the final piece of a puzzle he'd been working on for a very long time. "Beautiful," he repeated, the word a soft puff of air. A small, incredulous smile touched his lips. "No one's ever called me that before. They should have," I whispered. He closed the last few inches between us. His hand came up, not fast, but with a slow, deliberate motion that gave me 1,000 years to pull away. He didn't touch my face. He gently took the sketchbook from my nerveless fingers and set it aside. Then his hand came back, and his fingers lightly brushed my jaw, his thumb stroking the corner of my mouth. The touch was questioning, hesitant. It was a universe away from the brash confidence he projected at the office. This was Julian, real and uncertain and right here. My breath hitched. I leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. It was all the answer he needed. He leaned in, his eyes searching mine, asking a final, silent question. I gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. And then his lips were on mine. It was not a kiss of passion, not a frantic, pent-up desire. It was slow. It was gentle. It was unbelievably soft. It was a kiss of discovery, of quiet revelation. His lips were warm and tasted faintly of coffee and wood smoke. He kissed me with a tenderness that I never would have believed him capable of, a careful, searching pressure that felt more intimate than anything I could have ever imagined. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was the beginning of a new language that we were both just learning to speak. When he pulled back, it was only by an inch. Our foreheads rested together. His eyes were still closed. "Leo," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. I think I've been missing it for a very long time. The dam inside me broke. Years of carefully suppressed longing, of hopeless pining, of lonely nights, all washed away in a wave of overwhelming relief and a joy so potent it felt like pain. I didn't say anything. I just wrapped my arms around his neck and held on, burying my face in his shoulder, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the solid, real warmth of his body against mine. He held me back, his arms strong and sure around me. And in the shelter of the small cabin, with the storm still raging outside, I finally, for the first time in my life, felt safe. I woke to the unfamiliar weight of an arm draped over my waist. For a disorienting second, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came flooding back in a dizzying, heart-stopping rush. Julian, the cabin, the confession, the kiss. I was in my own cot, but he was there with me, curled behind me, his body a warm, solid presence against my back. His breathing was deep and even, the soft puff of his exhales warm against my neck. We hadn't done anything more than kiss, but we had fallen asleep like this, tangled together in the narrow cot, exhausted by the emotional torrent of the night. The storm had passed. Sunlight, pale and watery, was streaming through the cabin window. The world outside was unnaturally quiet, washed clean. But inside me, a new storm was brewing. The harsh light of morning felt accusatory. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the messy pile of our clothes, the stark reality of the situation. Last night, in a magical, fire-lit bubble of the storm, everything had felt possible, honest. But now it was just the morning after. Anxiety, cold and sharp, began to creep into the warm corners of my chest. What have I done? What have we done? He was my boss. He was straight. This was a mistake. A moment of cabin fever, of isolation-induced madness. He would wake up, realize what happened, and be filled with regret. Or worse, disgust. The professional distance would return, but this time it would be a wall of ice, thick and impassable, and I would have been the one to build it. I lay perfectly still, my body rigid, afraid to move and wake him. I wanted to savor this moment, the simple, profound intimacy of his arm around me. But my mind was already racing, cataloging every possible negative outcome. The silence that had felt so full and comforting last night now felt fragile, ready to shatter. My sanctuary had become a minefield. Slowly, carefully, I tried to slide out from under his arm. I needed space. I needed to breathe air that wasn't thick with his scent and my own panic. But the moment I moved, his arm tightened instinctively, pulling me closer against him. He mumbled something in his sleep, a soft, incoherent sound, and buried his face in my shoulder. My heart hammered against my ribs. A part of me, the foolish, hopeful part, soared. But the anxious, practical part screamed that this was only making it worse. This was a deeper entanglement before the inevitable, painful severing. Eventually, he began to stir. His breathing changed, and I felt the moment he woke, the slight tensing of his muscles as he became aware of his surroundings, of me. His arm didn't move. For a long, agonizing moment, he was completely still. I held my breath, bracing myself. Then he withdrew his arm. The loss of his warmth was immediate and absolute. I felt a chill spread across my back. He sat up, swinging his legs over the side of the cot, his back to me. "Morning," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of any of the warmth from the night before. It was the voice of Julian Kane, project manager. The cold knot of fear in my stomach tightened into a fist of ice. "It's happening." The recoil. "Morning," I managed to choke out, my own voice a pathetic whisper. He stood up and stretched, a gesture that seemed deliberately casual. He didn't look at me. He walked over to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked forest. Looks like the road might be passable by this afternoon. We should pack up, and that was it. No mention of last night. No acknowledgement of the kiss, the words, the way we had held each other. It was as if it had all been a dream, a hallucination brought on by the storm. He was erasing it. He was putting the wall back up, brick by painful brick. And I was letting him. What else could I do? I couldn't force him to acknowledge something he so clearly regretted. The silence during the drive back to the city was a new kind of torture. It was heavier, more profound than the professional silence of the drive up. This silence was full of ghosts. It was filled with the echoes of confessions and the phantom feeling of his lips on mine. I stared out my window, the passing scenery a blur. Every mile closer to home felt like a step back into the lonely reality I had inhabited before. The brief, beautiful interlude was over. When he pulled up in front of my apartment building, he kept the engine running. He still didn't look at me. "I'll have the survey data compiled by tomorrow," I said, my voice sounding hollow and formal in the confines of the car. I was desperate to say something, anything, to break the crushing weight between us. "Good," he said. Just one word. He cleared his throat. "See you at the office on Monday, Leo." He used my name. But it wasn't a secret anymore. It was a dismissal. I got out of the car without another word, grabbed my bags from the back, and walked towards my building. I didn't look back. I heard the sound of his car pulling away from the curb, the noise fading until it was gone, leaving me in a silence that was vaster and emptier than any I had ever known. My apartment, once my sanctuary, felt like a tomb. The familiar quiet, the neat, orderly lines of my furniture, all of it seemed to mock me. It was the architecture of a lonely life, a life I had been given a fleeting, tantalizing glimpse of escaping. Now, the solitude was no longer a comfort. It was an absence, a hollow space where Julian should have been. The weekend was a descent into hell. 48 hours of replaying every moment, every word, every touch. I dissected his confession. "I missed the way you looked at me." Had he just meant he missed the ego boost? Had it all been a game, a way to alleviate the boredom of being trapped in a cabin? And the kiss, had it just been curiosity, an experiment? My mind, the same mind that could solve complex structural problems, became a self-torture device. I convinced myself I had misread everything. I had projected my own desperate fantasies onto a simple, friendly moment. I had been foolish, presumptuous. I had ruined the one professional relationship that mattered to me. Monday morning loomed like an execution. How could I face him? How could I go back to watching him from a distance, now that I knew the devastating closeness of his arms? By Sunday night, I was a wreck. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. I was just a ghost haunting my own apartment, hollowed out by anxiety and regret. I was staring at the ceiling, tracing the cracks in the plaster, when there was a knock at my door. My heart leaped into my throat. It couldn't be. It was probably a neighbor or a delivery for the wrong apartment. I ignored it. Another knock. Louder this time. Insistent. With a sense of dread, I dragged myself off the couch and went to the door. I looked through the peephole, and the world stopped. It was Julian. He stood in the hallway, illuminated by the harsh overhead light. He looked terrible. His hair was a mess. There were dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing a wrinkled t-shirt and jeans. The bespoke suit, the armor of confidence, was gone. He just looked like a man. An ex-haustet anxiosman. He was running a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew meant he was stressed. I opened the door. We just stood there for a moment, staring at each other. The hallway between us felt 100 miles wide. Can I come in?" he asked. His voice was quiet, uncertain. All the bluster and command were gone. I just nodded, stepping back to let him pass. He walked into my living room and stood in the middle of the floor, looking around as if he'd never seen an apartment before. He seemed out of place, a force of nature contained within my small, quiet walls. I closed the door, my heart pounding a frantic, unsteady rhythm. "I'm an idiot," he said, finally turning to face me. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been holding them back for days. "I am a complete and utter idiot, Leo, and I'm sorry." I just stared at him, unable to form a response. The way I acted, he continued, taking a step closer. In the car, this whole weekend, I panicked. This is not my area of expertise. He gestured vaguely between us. Feelings. This. You. His vulnerability was disarming. This was not the man I'd spent years idolizing and fearing from afar. This was someone new. Someone just as scared as I was. I spent my whole life on a track, he said, his voice raw. Go to the right schools, get the right job, date the right women. Build a life that looks good on paper. It was easy. It was a plan. And then I started working with you, and I saw you watching me, and it was like you saw something nobody else did. You weren't looking at the project manager. You were looking at me, and it terrified me, and I liked it. God, I liked it so much he took another step. We were so close now. And in that cabin, everything came off the tracks, and it was the realest thing I have ever felt in my entire life. And it scared the hell out of me. So I ran. I put the wall back up because it's all I know how to do. And I have been miserable every second since I drove away from you. This silence, it's been deafening, the silence. He had felt it too. The weight, the emptiness. It wasn't just in my head. A wave of relief, so powerful it made my knees weak, washed over me. I thought you regretted it, I whispered. I thought it was a mistake. No, he said, his voice firm, his eyes locking with mine. No, the only mistake was me being a coward. The only mistake was driving away. He reached out and took my hand. His fingers laced with mine, a perfect, solid fit. The spark was still there, but this time it wasn't a shock. It was a gentle, steady warmth that spread through my entire body. I don't know what this is, Leo, he said, his voice low and earnest. And I don't know where it's going. I'm new to this map. I'm completely lost. But I don't want to be lost without you. I don't want to go back to how things were. Me neither, I said, and my voice was finally steady. The fear was still there, a faint tremor in the background, but it was overshadowed by a vast, soaring hope. He smiled, a small, tired, beautiful smile. Good. He hesitated for a second, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a single key on a plain metal ring. He pressed it into my free hand and closed my fingers around it. It was cool against my skin. What's this? I asked, confused. It's my key, he said simply, to my place. I don't want there to be any more walls. I want you to know the door is always open. For you. Always. I stared down at the key in my palm. It was such a small object. A simple piece of cut metal, but it felt heavier than a foundation stone. It was a promise. A tangible act of commitment. It was him, handing me access to his life, to his private space, just as he was asking for access to mine. It was the most romantic gesture I could have ever imagined. I looked up at him, my eyes blurring with tears I hadn't realized were there. I didn't know what to say, so I just tightened my grip on his hand, raised the key, and pressed it to my lips. Then I stepped forward into his space and kissed him. This time, there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. It was a kiss of homecoming, a kiss that sealed a promise. He kissed me back, a deep, reassuring pressure that said everything words couldn't. And this time, when he wrapped his arms around me, I knew he wasn't going to let go. The following weeks were a strange and wonderful dream. We moved slowly, cautiously, learning the rhythms of this new reality. The office was the hardest part. We kept it professional, but it was a different kind of professional now. It was charged with a secret energy that only we could feel. A brief, shared glance across a conference table held a novel's worth of meaning. The accidental brush of his hand on my back as he passed my desk was no longer a source of panic, but a quiet thrill. But the real change happened outside those walls. It happened on a Tuesday night when he showed up at my door with takeout because he knew I'd be working late. It happened when I used his key for the first time, letting myself into his shockingly minimalist apartment and finding a space for my toothbrush in his bathroom. It happened in the small, quiet moments of domesticity that I had only ever read about. One Saturday morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee. I opened my eyes, and for a moment, the old anxiety flared, the fear of the morning after. But then I saw him. Julian was in my kitchen, wearing a pair of my gray sweatpants that were too short on him, moving with a comfortable familiarity that made my heart ache with happiness. He was making coffee. In my kitchen. Like he belonged there. I got up and went to him, wrapping my arms around his waist from behind and resting my head on his strong back. He leaned back into me, his hand coming up to cover mine. "Morning," he murmured, his voice still rough with sleep. "Morning," I replied, my voice muffled by his t-shirt. We just stood there for a minute, the coffee maker gurgling softly, the morning sun streaming through the window. The silence was easy. It was full. It was the sound of contentment. This was the new beginning. A quiet, steady, domestic intimacy that was more thrilling than any grand, passionate gesture. It was real. He turned in my arms to face me, a mug of coffee in his hand. He handed it to me, his fingers brushing mine. That simple touch, the one that had once sent me into a spiral of panic, now just felt like home. He looked at me, his eyes soft in the morning light. "What are you thinking about?" I took a sip of the coffee. It was perfect. "I was just thinking," I said, looking around my small apartment, at this man who had completely upended my carefully ordered life. "About architecture." He raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, I said, a smile spreading across my face. "I spent my whole life building walls to keep myself safe. I designed a life with no room for error, no room for disruption. And then you came along. You were the plot twist I never saw coming. The wrecking ball to my quiet, orderly facade. I reached out and traced the scar on his eyebrow, a detail I was now intimately familiar with. You didn't just break down my walls, Julian. You showed me how to build a door. You were the disruption that led me to a better design." A truer 1 inch, he leaned down and kissed me, a soft, sweet kiss that tasted like coffee and the promise of 1,000 more mornings just like this one. "For a quiet guy, you have a way with words, Leo." I just smiled into the kiss. My life was no longer a solitary, predictable blueprint. It was a collaboration, a messy, beautiful, and constantly evolving design we were creating together. And I knew, with an absolute certainty that settled deep in my bones, that this was the most magnificent structure I would ever have the privilege to help build. It's funny how a single, honest question can change the entire trajectory of your life. For years, I was content in my silent observation, never daring to want more. Have you ever been so afraid of losing something you don't even have that you refuse to reach for it? I lived in that fear until someone finally had the courage to ask me why I was looking. I'd love to hear your thoughts on taking that kind of leap in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing for more.